In thinking about the implications, the ramifications, the different readings of the Oedipus Complex, one issue is perhaps obvious, but very easy to neglect. Certainly when we're dealing with these issues in Lacanian terms, it helps just to bear this in mind. What is mother? What is father? Not in the literal sense of your mother and father, but what do those concepts represent for the unconscious? In other words, what is mother as an unconscious prospect? What is father as an unconscious, or in this respect, symbolic prospect? So just to keep that degree of abstraction and that minimal difference between thinking about these key operating principles in literal terms. We're going to try and conclude now, and we're going to build to the conclusion where, with the aid of Darian Leader, who's going to suggest that there's three crucial outcomes of the Oedipus complex. We want to get a sense of what those three crucial outcomes are, and we want to suggest also that that will be very crucial for clinical work. So as opposed to this idea that we're just theorizing for the sake of theorizing, for the sake of resuscitating Freud, what I think Leader helpfully does is he pulls out three crucial elements that the theory allows us to focus on that will be very helpful in thinking about how to start clinical work with certain subjects. But let's then continue by making a point, kept at number 4 on the board, the radar of desire consequences. That's, as you know, my coinage. But what I think Stein van Hurle, in this somewhat lengthy quote from pages 60 to 61 of his Subject of Psychosis book, what he nicely foregrounds, and we'll use his words, I'll refer directly to him in a moment, is that if this process of the paternal metaphor is successful, the substitution for the mother of desire, the substitution of the name of the father for the desire of the mother, when that's successful, it is kind of like the installation of a matrix of desire sensibilities. This is how Van Hurle puts it. Maternal desire can be interpreted in terms of communally accepted ways people relate to each other. And let's just say, obviously, that when the paternal metaphor has been successful, when the Oedipus complex, to use more Freudian terms, has done its thing, then maternal desire can be interpreted in terms of communally accepted ways that people relate to each other. Remember, we noted above that prior to this, the desire of the mother, as important as it may be, is murky. It's lacking in definition. It's somewhat enigmatic. By contrast, through this process of the paternal metaphor, maternal desire is integrated into normative discourse. And I like the way he puts it. It means that there's a greater degree of intelligibility for the desire of others. And remember, in psychoanalytic theory, what could be more important if one's trying to get a sense of where one is located in the symbolic world, where one is located relative to other people, than getting some kind of working hypothesis about what is desirable here, what is desirable for them, what might be desirable for me. Incidentally, of course, that's also the very motor engine of fantasy, the way that one situates oneself in the world. Back to Van Hurle, installing the paternal signifier, okay, the name of the father, in other words, enables the subject to understand what motivates human interrelationships in general. That's the point I was just trying to make. It provides an internalized compass of culturally and socially viable principles. If you would like to look at that quote in a little bit more detail, he makes a number of important points to back it up. We're looking at pages 60 and 61 in his book, The Subject of Psychosis. But that point is what I'm trying to get a sense of. In a way, one of the reasons we're talking about this at such length is because we're also interested in the psychical architecture that differentiates psychosis from neurosis. And when we've had the installation of the name of the father, the operation of the paternal metaphor is successful, we have an internalized compass of culturally and socially viable principles. You are kind of mainlining the symbolic, right? You are properly understanding, living and breathing those kinds of values which have been installed, as has your radar of desire, as I call it. My attempt to summarize or encapsulate some of what Van Hurle is saying there is that the paternal metaphor means that we have now a matrix for making sense of desire, a matrix for making sense of the desire of others, of our own, of the social sphere as a whole. And let's also emphasize, as we already have, that is a very domesticating thing in the best sense, is that the world is less threatening. my desires, the desire of others, becomes legible. That's not to say that there might not be scary people out there with horrible desires. It's not to say that my desire is ever fully domesticated, but at least it gives us a lens, a matrix of intelligibility for how to handle those kinds of desires. We've done that work with Van Hurler. Let's now turn to Darian Leader's What is Madness, and to look at two formulations that he offers. The first is what I've called mother as minus sign. And here we're looking at pages 65 of his book, What is Madness? Let's give the direct quote. He's talking about negativity, and he's doing a kind of a précis of those crucial moments in Lacan's Seminar 5, where he is also thinking through and trying to specify what the paternal metaphor does. So here's Darian Leader. The Oedipal process introduces a negativity into our lives. This results in the establishment of lack. We've given up the mother to create a zone of emptiness that later objects can occupy. We register that we cannot be everything for her, for the mother. Recognizing that her behavior has a cause not linked to us is tragic and liberating at the same time. Without this, everything would be interpreted as referring to oneself. So just a few comments on this. I like the idea that in giving up one's mother, and of course he's kind of overlaying Freud with Lacan here, in the giving up of one's mother, one creates a zone of emptiness. Remember, I've stressed so many times here that negativity, the minus sign, is enabling. That opening up of a zone of emptiness is something which he says is both tragic, you've lost the mother, but it's also liberating. It's a zone of emptiness. In other words, one way of thinking about that is to have repressed the desire of the mother, as opened up a desire of emptiness, a zone of emptiness, which also means that you're open and able to take on new libidinal objects. In other words, new persons, new people, new things to fall in love with. You could say it would be truly tragic if that zone of emptiness wasn't opened up, if one remains steadfast, completely devoted to the figure of one's mother. There would be no possibility of other future libidinal objects. He also wants to stress that once one has recognized that her behavior has a cause not linked to us, in other words, one starts to be able to appreciate not only mother has a desire, what could it be, but that desire is beyond us. It kind of frees us of that obligation to which you could say we kind of naturally gravitate, of trying to do the Jerry Maguire thing of be everything for her. To be freed of that is in a way an enormous gift, hence his reference to how liberating it is. Without this, everything would be interpreted as referring to oneself. One would be constantly trying to think about what mother's doing in response to me. Now, if I remember correctly, Leader doesn't make the point here, but I think partly what he might be implying is that in certain moments in psychosis, and because I've done a little bit of work with the John Nash, A Beautiful Mind case, it certainly does seem pertinent there. In the midst of his psychotic break, everything is read about how it refers back to him. So, he finds Life magazine and there's a picture of the Pope and it's actually him. And the newspaper, the New York Times, has got an encoded message to him. So in a way, although we want to be cautious about doing a reductive thing like this particular empirical moment in the subject's life is now predisposing them to psychosis, I'm kind of a bit cautious with that. We don't want to do that. But you could nevertheless say there's an interesting parallel between the moments of developmental life prior to the resolution of Oedipus, prior to the operation of the paternal metaphor, where the subject is trying to understand the mother's desire, always in terms of them and its implications for them. That sounds a little bit like some moments in psychosis, particularly schizophrenia, paranoid schizophrenia, where there is a sense that everything happening in the world refers somehow back to me. So an interesting overlap. Let's draw then to our conclusion. Leader wants to suggest that there's three fundamental outcomes of the Oedipus complex. Three fundamental outcomes, we could say, of the installation of the name of the father. Three fundamental outcomes, again, we can put it in slightly different terms, of what it means when the paternal metaphor has started to operate. Number one for Leader, this introduces meaning. Well, maybe we could argue. It's not that I think it introduces meaning, but I think it domesticates it, locates, it crystallizes, it anchors meanings. It's not like there's not meanings prior to this, but, and here he's a little bit more specific, it ties the question of the desire of the mother, and indeed not just the desire of the mother, you could say the desire of the mother with a big O, others generally. It ties the question of other people's desires to an answer. Name of the father and the phallus. How can we put that in more straightforward terms? Again, if we find the others, the desire of others, as somehow plaguing, as somehow problematic, as menacing, as difficult to understand, and you could think about the whole of psychoanalysis as, in some respects, responding to this question. So Freud famously asks, what does the woman want? Frantz Fanon asks, what does the black man want? This seems to be a question of what others want. And that question is a threatening question. So without too much of a digression, I remember some years ago, I think it's the New Statesman, it's a kind of a political magazine in the United States, they had on the front cover, what does ISIS want? In other words, the question of the desires of others, potentially others, threatening others somehow, is always a kind of menacing, slightly worrying one. But leave that aside, what we're saying here, I've called it a domestication or an intelligibility engendering process, where previously meanings kind of weren't so defined, weren't so anchored, meaning now does become a bit more of an operative, anchored sensibility and intelligibility if, when it comes to the mother's desire, or indeed the other's desire more generally, we can utilize those two symbolic resources, the phallus and the name of the father. What are those two symbolic resources? The name of the father is what locates us in consensual understandings of reality, common affirmed consensual norms, values that are within the symbolic domain. What's the phallus? The phallus is what I call the radar of desire, getting a sense of what is lacking, what is desirable in me, what's desirable in others, what do others desire. With those two psychical instruments, and maybe we even need to come up with a different vocabulary here, those things are going to make meaning work, meaning anchor us, intelligibility of the world work. The second point, says Leader, is that once the paternal metaphor has been, is operating, has been completed as it were, although of course presumably it's a process, it's a metaphor, it results in the localization of libido. We have, once this occurs, libido starts to be directed towards elements that remind us of the lost mother. Objects of our desire are located outside of the body. He doesn't elaborate enough on this, I think, but let's just say that one of the crucial differential factors, and a lot of this understanding is important for thinking in differential diagnostics between psychosis on the one hand and neurosis. Neurotics have jouissance, they have libidinal enjoyment, they have that pleasurable, suffering, symptomatic enjoyment, morbid excitation. We've given a whole series of descriptions of this in our lectures on enjoyment. They've got a kind of enjoyment strategy. They've got an enjoyment domestication. There's that word again. They have a sense of the kind of portfolio, you could say, of sexual activities, the type of person, all of that starts to kind of make sense. If we were going back to Freud, you could say that his idea of the psychosexual stages is one way of trying to theorize that. How libido, which for Freud to begin with, is polymorphously perverse. There's multiple different types of bodily pleasure that could be sexualized. But through one's development, through one's historical progress as a subject, if you're a neurotic subject, that becomes domesticated. It starts to become a little bit more like, I used the word before, like a portfolio, the kinds of things that I like to do, the things I don't like to do, the kinds of things that might be a little turn on, so on and so forth. It might be highly distinctive. In fact, you could say it's as distinctive as my thumbprint, but it kind of has a general intelligibility. It makes sense, my sexuality. If jouissance isn't somehow pinned down, if it's not domesticated, then one can imagine that it can come from the outside. It can flood me. One can experience, as does Judge Schreber in Freud's case study, the rays that attack his body, that that infuse him in this kind of disturbing jouissance, which isn't located in a kind of what I call sexual portfolio. Leader's point here is that within the paternal metaphor, one's libido is given some kind of focus, one that's outside the body, something that is going to be focused at, might we say, insignia or memories of the trace of something like the mother, but it's not simply within my own body anymore. It's given an external, domesticated focus. We could say more about that, but we need to finish up. The third crucial element of this resolution of the Oedipus complex is that the paternal metaphor allows us to situate ourselves in relationship to the other, to find a safe distance from the other. This is already implicit in some of the other things that we've said. When we've said that the mother's desire is initially somewhat murky, let's think about that in more societal, sociological terms. The desire of the big other, the desire of multiple little others, of the social location in which we find ourselves, is presumably in states of psychosis very murky indeed. It's not clear. It's almost as if one has to, via delusions, come up with one's own account of what's going on in society. And that sometimes takes on a paranoid quality, and I would argue does so precisely because one's desire radar isn't really working. One of the things which would make psychosis a rather painful state, or triggered psychosis a rather painful state, is not being able to keep the big other at a comfortable distance. And we've spoken about this as well. If the big other is impinging upon us, is too close or not operative at all, it becomes very difficult to manage oneself within some form of social intelligibility and social relations. So let's conclude then. We've spoken at length about the paternal metaphor, and what I think in Leader's rather elegant summation of what he thinks via Lacan is accomplished via the paternal metaphor, that is, in Freudian terms, via the resolution of the Oedipus complex, is the domestication of meaning. The world around us can be now understood via the intelligibility that is enabled by the name of the Father, being anchored in the symbolic, and by the radar of desire, of the phallus. Number two, jouissance, bodily, libidinal enjoyment is likewise also domesticated. It's given a form, it's given manageable parameters outside the body, and there's a sense of desirability. It's not chaotic, it's not going to impinge upon me in a kind of unexpected way. And lastly, we've got the right striking distance, the at arm's length distance from the big other, that we can start to read and make educated guesses, so to speak, at their desire, without them being impinging, without them being too close or too far away. And let's end that with just one last comment. There's a really perspicacious comment in Seminar 3 when Lacan says one way of thinking about psychosis, I think he might mean paranoia, is when the big other and the little other somehow become the same. You could imagine that that is a rather threatening process. It's one where these forms of management of the other, location of meaning, location of jouissance, have stopped working. Let's stop there.